So that modern monetary theory has changed that dialogue. And they're arguing about inflation. They're saying, well, if we've already got inflation, if we spend all this, inflation is going to go higher. And that's what they argued back home, when they go to talk to their constituency. Oh, the government's spending like a drunken sailor. We have 6.8% inflation. We've got to stop them before we turn into Venezuela. They don't say the checks are going to bounce.
Which is what they used to say, right?
Right. President Trump said, we're not going to bounce checks. We print the money. Now, he didn't exactly have the reason, right? But he knew they're not going to bounce checks.
I stumbled across a Wall Street Journal article about modern money theory, and normally when I see these, it's usually something like modern money theory is absolute trash and completely ridiculous and blah, 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 blah. And this one wasn't quite that. And so I got the article right here. And what I thought might be fun is if I started reading through it, and you just stop me wherever you want to stop me, and react or comment or correct or whatever you want to do. Okay. So this is I don't have the date. This is from a couple weeks ago, so mid-November or something like that. And first of all, the title is "Modern Monetary Theory Isn't Coming in the Future; It's Here Now."
True. It's always been here. But the understanding now has worked its way up to where the central banks talk about it. They may not be saying it correctly, but I suspect they know what it is because they have hundreds of PhDs who actually read the source literature. So if they're not, if their public narrative isn't correct, it's because they don't want it to be correct at this point.
Yeah. The Infrastructure Act signed into law last week marked a defeat for the faction of progressive economists in ascendancy in 2020. For these advocates of modern monetary theory, the insistence by both political parties that all the $550 billion of new spending be matched by offsetting revenue, known as pay-fors, goes against their belief that money is merely a tool for the government.
Yeah, well, yes and no. They did $5 trillion the year before without even discussing pay for. Look, what they know is that the government, whatever they decide, the checks are not going to bounce, and that decision per se will not drive up interest rates. It's up to the Fed to decide the interest rate. They didn't act like that a few years ago when Paul Ryan said we were going to be the next Greece, and President Obama went to China to talk to our bankers about funding his healthcare plan. They didn't know that. They thought we were dependent on foreign borrowing for taxes plus foreign borrowing to be able to spend, or the checks might bounce. We would turn into Greece. You didn't hear one of them say anything about turning into Greece. They just, so that hasn't happened. They've got these pay-fors and they want to raise revenue here, and they're fighting for the agendas of their constituents, which are, less government, keep government out of these things. And there's an aversion to, big government out there. And I think that's what it's come down to. They know the checks won't bounce. They don't want the government involved in these areas. They don't want the government spending the money. And they just don't want to do it. It's not about they might bounce the check. So that modern monetary theory has changed that dialogue. And they're arguing about inflation. They're saying, well, if we've already got inflation, if we spend all this, inflation is going to go higher. And that's what they argued back home, when they go to talk to their constituency. Oh, the government's spending like a drunken sailor. We have 6.8% inflation. We've got to stop them before we turn into Venezuela. They don't say the checks are going to bounce.
Which is what they used to say, right?
Right. President Trump said, we're not going to bounce checks. We print the money. Now, he didn't exactly have the reason, right? But he knew they're not going to bounce checks. It used to be the fear of bouncing checks, of not being able to get the money, being on our knees to the IMF like Greece. That was what the rhetoric was. You don't hear that anymore. And that's changed because of the MMT understanding. The political battle over large versus small government is still there. Okay, but it's no longer about solvency. We're going to lose our credit rating. You don't hear that anymore.
So you're saying that when these politicians are talking for pay-fors, even they probably know that's not the actual reason. They're just using that as a way to talk to the constituency because they don't like the thing that wants to be created with that money, or what that money is going to be used for.
Look, and underneath the surface of all that, they're worried about the tipping point. Are you familiar with that argument?
The tipping point of what?
They see the voters as two voters out there, kinds of voters. There's the givers and the takers. Mm-hmm. And the takers vote for larger checks. And the givers have to pay for it. They're the ones actually doing the work. And once you pass the tipping point where the takers
I know what you're talking
are
about,
more than 50%, then it all just spirals into Venezuela. And so they cite these tax numbers. They do it mostly. They don't say it publicly, so nationally anymore, but they say it locally about how that only 30-some% of Americans pay taxes. Now they conveniently leave out the Social Security tax, which would get that number up to 65% or whatever.
Right.
Because it's not a tax; it's an investment. They know it isn't, but they say that. And they call it an investment so they can, play the givers and takers narrative. Okay, and people are petrified of that. And now they're sending out all these checks as free money. And in the next election, are you going to vote? They're afraid all the takers are going to vote for bigger checks, and they don't care what the policies are. Now you have these one-issue voters who just want to see the checks keep coming.
Right.
And that's going to end life as we know it. So that's kind of the narrative that they're playing back home. And it's not so much about the pay-fors, but we got to obstruct this and stop this any way we can, because it's going to be the end of life as we know.
So make up something that the voters will agree
go
to.
along with something they already know that's there, and the voters go along with it because beneath the surface they don't want any more government checks going out. They just don't like it.
Mm-hmm. We'll keep reading. Yeah. This is a temporary rhetorical setback. The reality is that MMT's ideas have insinuated themselves deep into government, central banking, and even Wall Street. And the Infrastructure Act is in fact deficit financed anyway.
Yeah, true. And it's all deficit finance anyway. They seem to think MMT is applying a different way of financing. But what we say is the method of finance is, when you look at the debits and credits at the Fed, it's inconsequential. At the end of the day, it's all the same. So don't. The monetarists still look at it as different kinds of funding, and we just say, no, it's all the same thing if you look very closely.
Yeah, MMT acknowledges that all funding is deficit funding, because you have to deficit fund first before you take any of that money back in, right?
Well, yeah. If the government spends, it credits accounts. When taxes are paid, the accounts are debited. If there's any money left over, they can sit there in the accounts, or they can use it to buy bonds, which is just alternative accounts. So the money spent, it goes into either reserve accounts or securities accounts, no matter what you do, whether you call it overt monetary spending or printing money, you call it anything you want. At the end of the day, the accounts look the same at the Fed. It's just different names on the same accounts.
MMTers detest pay-fors as wrong-headed thinking about money. Money only exists because of government spending, and under MMT, the government should just create as much as it needs to finance its projects. In a tight economy, like we have now, MMT might want offsets to do spending. But higher taxes or lower spending elsewhere would be aimed at avoiding inflation, not balancing the budget.
So what our money story says is, first we impose a tax liability. That creates things that are for sale because people need the money to pay the tax. So they'll sell their labor, they'll sell pizzas, they'll sell whatever they have to get funds to pay their house tax, to not lose their house. Sticking with the house tax analogy. So, but it only creates a finite number of things for sale, just enough to get the funds that they need from the government to pay the tax, because the source of that tax money is the government. And so it creates a finite amount of things for sale. So the government can then buy with its otherwise worthless dollars anything that's offered for sale. If it's not offered for sale, they can't buy it. They don't send the army in to take your food. You have to offer it for sale, or the government can't buy it. It has to be voluntary. And so if they've bought everything for sale at current prices and now they're starting to pay higher prices, they are redefining their currency downward. They're paying more for the same thing. They're making it easier to get the money. They're saying it used to be $50,000 for a soldier. We need more soldiers. Now it's $60,000 for a soldier, right? They've just devalued the currency. They've redefined it down. It's about what we have to do to get it. They made it easier to get $60,000, right?
Right.
And so once prices start offered to the government start going up, if they pay that price, now they're institutionalizing higher prices, which we casually call inflation. Okay. Subject to everything I told you earlier about inflation. That's casually called inflation without getting into that. So that is the MMT money story, the understanding. It's really not disputable. The way you said it is the way a lot of MMT proponents have said it. And it's not wrong, but it's not
right.
It's ambiguous. It's got some ambiguities in there that they might not have in their mind with the narrative, but there's plenty of ambiguities on the listener part, and this article is picking up the ambiguities.
Well, and would it make sense if I said it this way? The way that this guy just wrote it is he's addressing the price issue from the relative standpoint, which is the market depending on the market yesterday. And so MMT tries to control prices, control inflation by how much money's in there, because that's how the relative play out is going to happen.
He says, worse than that, he says MMT is trying to control inflation. MMT is just telling you the source of the price level where it comes from.
Right.
They're not trying to do anything. It's just a framework for analysis. So by saying MMT is trying to do this, now he's saying, and if it doesn't, then MMT has failed. It's like, it's not at all correct.
Well, and it's kind of like saying gravity failed. Right? Yeah. It's like, it's just a description of what I'm looking at, right?
Yeah.
I'll keep going.
If I look at if you look at a television set, you see people moving across the television. If you get really close, all you see is dots going on and off. Nothing's moving. And so, now I can tell you what you have to do to make things look like they're moving. You turn dots on and off. And if something happens moving on the set, it crashes or something, you say, oh, MMT failed. Well, no, I'm just telling you
how the dots were moving.
Dots on and off, and it'll look like it's moving. I'm not telling you how that's going to affect anything else. It's up to you.
Yeah. The government hasn't embraced MMT, but important elements of it are now accepted by much of the economic and financial establishment, with major implications for how the economy is run.
Agreed. Totally agree.
The most important claim of MMT is that government need never default on debt issued in its own currency. The lesson of 2020 is that MMT was right.
Okay. I'd say it a little differently. I say, look, government always has the ability to pay in its own currency because it just credits your account. It changes your number. That's all it ever does. But it might not have the willingness to pay. So if Congress says, well, we passed the debt ceiling, so we're not going to pay, then they default.
Yeah.
Okay. It's the will of Congress to default. So
they choose to default. It's not that the check's bounced.
Right. It's willingness versus ability, which is how the rating agencies are supposed to be looking at it, claim they're looking at it.
Mm-hmm. We got 5 or 6. This is in quotes. We got $5 or $6 trillion of spending and tax cuts without anyone worrying about pay-fors. So that was a good thing, says L. Randall Ray, an economics professor at Bard College in New York and a leading MMT academic. Again in quotes. In January 2020, MMT was a crazy idea, and then in March, it was okay. We're going to adopt MMT.
So look, he's exactly right, and he can say it's a good thing because he's an individual who can say that was good that we spent $5 trillion. Another individual might say that's a horrible thing that the government spent $5 trillion.
And they could be both MMT individuals, right?
Right.
Yeah.
All MMT has pointed out is that it could be $5 trillion or $10 trillion or 100. The check's not going to bounce.
Yeah.
And we're not going to drive up interest rates, and we're not going to have all these other issues that mainstream models have assigned to deficit spending in the past. Now, it might drive up prices, and some people argue that that's why the prices are higher. Fine, but the checks are not going to bounce, and that's what we've said. And what this did was demonstrate that MMT is correct, that the checks don't bounce.
It isn't just MMTers who say the world took a turn toward a new way of thinking. Again, in quotes, governments have lost their fear of debt, says Karen Ward, chief market strategist for EMEA at JP Morgan's Chase asset management arm. I don't know what that is. Again, in quotes, they were terribly worried about bond markets and investors punishing them. What they saw last year was record high levels of debt at record low levels of interest rates.
Right. So these asset management things are things that I don't think banks should be doing. So I don't see how that serves public purpose to have a bank call you up and say, look, put your money with us and we'll manage it for you. It's fine. It's a business. There are plenty of asset managers out there, but I don't see it as part of government infrastructure. And banking is part of the government public infrastructure. But that's a different point. Apart from that, yeah, that's correct.
Central banks that had struggled for a decade to boost inflation using monetary tools found that fiscal tools were far more powerful. Government spending does more for inflation than quantitative easing, it turns out, and central bank calls for more fiscal action to boost the economy are more likely to be accepted the next time deflation looms.
Yeah, I'd go further and just say, quantitative easing is just a placebo. It doesn't do anything. Never has. And looking at the accounts, which is what MMT does, there's absolutely no identifiable channel from quantitative easing to anything happening in the economy. It's just a technical shift at the Fed. And the idea that there's something more to it, I think is very far-fetched.
Key parts of MMT haven't been adopted, particularly its call for a government to guarantee everyone a job. But the MMT critique of the status quo, where the central bank modulates the number of unemployed people to control inflation, hit a nerve. The Federal Reserve shifted in favor of running the economy hot to reduce. The Federal Reserve shifted in favor of running the economy hot to reduce inequality. Employment has become more important in its thinking, and its move to a target of average inflation means it's willing to accept higher inflation than previously.
Okay, so look, MMT will assert that a transition job, an employed buffer stock, is a far superior price anchor than today's unemployment. It doesn't say you should go do it. You have to look at them and decide which one supports your political agenda. Would you like to have 5 million people unemployed, or would you feel better in a transition job where they can move to the private sector and have lower inflation the whole time? So we're showing you the policy options and what they're likely to achieve, and then it's up to the individuals to decide, what they want to do. And what was the second part there?
The Federal Reserve shifted in favor of running the economy hot to reduce inequality.
The Federal Reserve shifted their narrative, but we'll tell you they've got the interest rate things backwards. By leaving rates at zero, they were not running the economy hot. Okay,
as we just talked about at the beginning, that runs it a little colder. Yeah.
Well, the article itself acknowledges that the Fed has no power over inflation and that it's fiscal policy. And then next paragraph,
they actually do though. They actually do though, because raising rates is inflationary, right? It creates excess demand, which under current structure forces the price a little higher because they're suddenly paying interest that they weren't paying before. And that interest goes to only the people who have money. So what they've done is establish a policy. Positive rate policy is a policy of basic income, but only to people who already have money, proportionate to how much money they have. What kind of an insane policy is that?
Basic income for the rich, I like to call it.
Yeah, that only get one vote in Congress.
Right. Still, the Fed is, rightly, worried about inflation and is tweaking its tools to try to influence the economy with monetary policy, something MMTers think just doesn't work. As Mr. Ray points out, it wasn't when trillions in benefit checks landed in bank accounts last year that inflation went up. Prices went up when the recipients went out and spent the money. Money doesn't cause inflation, Mr. Ray argues, a view that infuriates monetary economists. Spending causes inflation.
It goes without saying. It's all by definition.
Yep.
Yeah.
In the next downturn, it is going to be very difficult for governments to resist calls to provide huge support, now that it has been shown that bond markets don't care. That should mean recessions are shallower, debt is higher, the government is more involved in the economy, and assuming the Fed doesn't accept that its tools are useless, interest rates are higher on average than in the past. Bond markets aren't pricing in anything of the sort, though. The 30-year Treasury yield is only 2%, well below the 3.2% average of the 10 years up to 2020.
Okay.
That was kind of a wide range. Any comments on that? I want me to keep going.
I can't remember it all, but I don't remember. Nothing stands out as
okay. Very good. Under full-blown MMT. You like that? You like that phrase? Full-blown. Pay-fors would be ditched for a mix of micro-planning and the resources needed for new projects and an assessment of the overall impact of the economy and potentially higher taxes.
Yeah, so once you understand how the money works, it's just natural. That's the way you would think.
Yeah.
So I don't know what you call that. Maybe under full-blown understanding of
I was going to say that it's just missing one word here, or two words. Full-blown understanding of MMT.
Yeah, right.
MMT is both.
But, they kind of do that. They kind of do that deliberately, to try and put MMT as some kind of threat out there or something.
Yeah. MMT is both right and wildly optimistic that higher taxes could slow an overheated economy and bring down inflation.
Yeah.
The flip side of last year's demonstration of the power of fiscal policy is that higher taxes can suck demand out of the economy more effectively than the Fed's interest rate tools.
Right. The Fed's interest rate tools would add demand, not suck it out. So it's true.
The rates are negative.
And look, any forecaster would agree. Yeah, negative rates would start to suck out, but they're talking about raising rates to fight inflation. So they just got backwards. But look, any forecaster would agree. Whenever they make a fiscal adjustment, the forecasters all revise their forecasts accordingly and in the right direction.
Because they know what's going to happen.
Yeah, and that includes all the Fed's forecasters. They've got all the data, and they know what's going to happen. Yeah.
There was a brief moment when it looked as though Democrats might impose higher taxes on billionaires as a part of the pay-fors for the roughly $2 trillion social spending bill, although they were dropped on first contact with reality. MMTers mostly aren't worried about President Biden's spending plans causing inflation anyway. But MMT prescribes that if tax rises are needed to slow demand, billionaires wouldn't be the target. The rest of us would.
Right, because they're not going to cut their spending. It's all about cutting their spending. Now, there might be reasons you want to tax them, but it's not to slow their spending. The reason you would be taxing would be to slow down spending, create more sellers of goods and services. A billionaire is not going to work harder to sell more of his services, not that they're worth anything anyway, but because his net worth goes from 100 billion to 90 billion or something. But,
right.
That's the point. The point isn't that anything more than that. And that's a fact. And that's called the marginal propensity to consume. And every mainstream economist agrees, but somehow they're targeting MMT economists when they say something that the entire mainstream agrees with and has been. It's called effective demand. It's been out there for, 100 years or more.
Again, in quotes, it makes more sense to have a broad-based tax that would reduce demand across the broader economy, especially people who have a propensity to spend 98%, which is the majority of Americans, Mr. Ray said.
Right, and that's a conditional statement. If you've got a problem where there's too much money being spent and you got to remove it, you got to remove some of the money that's being spent. But we don't have that problem, and I don't forecast that problem, but if hypothetically you had it, that would be one of the answers. Or to increase the supply of what's for sale, somehow, and reduce prices that way. Or to just directly alter price, which you can also do on a lot of items that don't have a cost of production. There's no marginal cost of production for downloading songs or something like that on the internet. So, it's very dependent on what the actual circumstances are. It's all in the details of prices rather than just looking at the price level and making a decision.
Like there's this big ocean that just kind of rises and falls.
Yeah. Look, if you got the Saudis and the Russians now together deciding what the price of oil is going to be, the price goes up. The problem isn't people have too much money to spend. You got to send the Fifth Fleet over to threaten Saudis or something, or else, and somehow get by Putin, or else you're not going to get a lower price. No matter what you do. This is a foreign monopolist. We have foreign monopolists in a lot of areas affecting our prices. If you're in Europe and all your gas is coming from Russia and they raise the price, you can do whatever you want with your interest rates. Until they lower the price, it's not going to go down. Or they raise it, it's going to go up. So,
especially since the U.S. Continues to impose bans on drilling and things like that domestically, makes us even more dependent on foreign oil.
Right, and the idea is we're supposed to not be using the stuff. And when we quit using, our consumption went down enormously when COVID first hit, like 50% emissions drop. All we have to do is grow the economy from that point and not allow anything that, adversely affected the environment. And we didn't do it. We just started it back up with all the old things that were adversely affecting the environment. And here we are, worse than where we started, trying to figure out how to cut it get it to zero, net change over the next 10 years. Well, we were already there. So who's serious about that? Look, I've got to run on you guys here.
Okay. Well, how about this? Before you run, it was almost the end of the article anyway.
Okay.
Want to give a rating to that article? Out of 10.
Oh, I'm good. It's good to see it out there. I'd give it about a 3 or a 4.
It's better than the ones, right?
Yeah, but it's the headline was good.
Yeah,
it's true, and a lot of parts are, but it's certainly not difficult enough where they couldn't be a whole lot more accurate in what they're saying and be more. They don't need to do this. I take it personally. I think they're just doing it to offend me.
To offend you, that's how I feel too.
Yeah.
All right, Warren. Well, You got to run. So thank you again for coming on, and you're welcome to come on again. We love having you on here. And
anytime, just let me know. I just happen to get a tennis match scheduled today because somebody canceled, so I'm going to fill it.
If everybody who's watching this now or recording could like, share, and subscribe it helps us out a lot.
Yeah.
I hate saying it, but it's just true.